I'm going to start now, and hopefully as we go into it, we'll get a few more attendees, but we've got a few now, so we're ready to go. So this is the fourth in the College of Law's Cybersecurity series, and my name is Dave Williams from FortiTech. We also have Matt See on the line, who'll be presenting from WatchGuard on firewalls and their security solutions. We've previously gone through security assessments and technology policy, passwords and multi-factor authentication, protecting data for remote users, which was certainly something as we've moved into the corona situation and with more people working remotely, and business continuity and backup, especially looking at those areas that are in the cloud and backing those up, such as Office 365, Xero, Gmail, or even your practice software that you've got in the cloud. So today we're talking about firewalls and next generation antivirus. We have a few more to finish off the year as we go through, and we'll get onto those as we come across them in the coming months. So today's agenda, we'll be looking at malware, firewalls, and threat detection and response. So what is malware? So malware, short for malicious software, is basically anything that's designed to cause damage to a technology device. And they can be from viruses and worms through to adware, or what's been very popular in recent years, ransomware, where they lock your computer up and they ask you to pay some Bitcoin to have that unlocked. So there's been a prevalence and certainly an increase in malware that's been going around. And it's coming smarter and smarter, and I guess the impact's higher and higher for businesses. So where does malware get in? Well, there's generally a few places that you need to look for. USBs is certainly one. Plugging something into your computer, regardless of where it's come from, it's a very good idea to scan it first. And if you've picked it up on the street, it's probably one of those things you don't want to plug in anyway. There are these devices out there that masquerade as USB keys and are actually malware, deployment devices. And they're specifically designed when people pick them up and put them in the computer to look like a keyboard, and they'll actually run keystrokes in the background to infect you. So it's quite a smart way of getting a piece of malware onto a computer. Phishing emails, probably the number one way that computers and technology are infected with malware these days is through phishing. You get the email, whether it says you need to reset your password or click here to do something, or download these files from Dropbox. People often click on them and see what's there, and at that point they usually infect themselves with malware. So vulnerabilities is a big one. Zoom, as an example, has had its history of vulnerabilities that they've patched in the past, and there's been a number that have been, pathways for malware to get onto your computer. And certainly as we come across more and more on technology, we're patching more and more. So there certainly is, a concern there that vulnerabilities in the software itself makes us susceptible for getting malware. Bundleware is a bit of an unusual one. There's bunches of free software out there that we can use for various bits and pieces, and some of them come with some things that may not be so great, and some of them actually come with malware in there. So we've got to just watch out what we're downloading for free and what it comes with and what it might be doing. And lastly, pop-ups. So probably not as much of an issue these days with software that is stopping this from happening, but certainly having the ability to pop up things behind in various browsers and being able to hijack that way. That being said, it's not particularly hard to inject code into a browser session, and there are man-in-the-middle attacks. A very famous one was done through Starbucks in the US, where 600 Starbucks sites were infected with Wi-Fi capturing devices called pineapples. And basically people were logging on to what they thought was Starbucks Wi-Fi, and instead getting the device that sat between Starbucks Wi-Fi and their device, and they were actually injecting code into their browser. So every time they'd visit any site, it would inject code in the background, and it was mining crypto coins for them. And I guess if you've ever been on any sort of Wi-Fi in any restaurant, it's not particularly fast, but most people wouldn't have noticed the speed difference and the fact that their computers were running faster as they were mining cryptocurrency. And it took a while to be caught, so that's certainly something to be mindful of out there. So why are we here today? if you didn't see the news, we have China that has increased its cyber attacks on Australia, and that's across the board. Just because you're a small business, don't think that you aren't going to be attacked. You are on the internet, which pretty much makes you a target. 88% of malware is considered 0-day, so virus checkers, the way they look at things is they use a signature. That means they've seen it before, they know how the software works, and they have a blueprint or signature of that malware. 0-day malware is basically stuff that nothing's seen before, and therefore it doesn't have the signature. So 88% is a very large chunk of what's coming through. We're talking hundreds of thousands of malware that comes new each year, and because of that, most of it we just haven't seen before, and that makes it 0-day. And to protect against it is a little bit harder because we don't know what it is, but things are getting smarter on that side as well. So this is a stat that is certainly a bit eye-opening. Cybercrime is expected to cost businesses US $6 trillion by 2021. What that basically means is that the amount of crime that's going out there for cybercrime is increasing so fast that it is eclipsing all the organized crime, or all the other ones put together. So it's certainly a very big growing industry. There's a lot of money to be made if you're on the wrong side of the table, which is why a lot of organized crime is getting into it these days. And prevention is definitely a multi-prong approach. We need to have not just the old school standard firewall that blocks things, and not just antivirus that looks for signatures. We need new firewalls, so the new generation of firewalls, and we need endpoint detection and response, which replaces AV or adds on to AV to provide those extra layers of defense. As the 88% of malware being 0-day, we can't just look at a signature that we've identified before. We have to look at other ways to be able to find out if something's malicious and block it before it does anything wrong. So the facts, as we said, 88% is considered 0-day. We've got 31 million different variants of malware that were identified by WatchGuard in Q1 of 2020. So that's just in Q1, and those were just the ones identified. So there is a huge amount of malware out there, and that number is growing hugely quickly every single day. We've got 140 million new malware variants created every year. So if you go back 20 years, we were talking about 50,000 pieces of malware that were known around 2000. That's 50,000 in total that were known. Now we're getting 140 million every year being created, and that number just keeps on going up. And 60% of all malware is delivered through HTTPS, which would have been considered a secure browser interface, is the number one way of deploying malware. Make it look like it's secure and push it out. As we've discussed in previous episodes of this, the NIST cybersecurity framework is how we're going to look at protecting businesses. And that is, where do these protections, firewall and AV, fit into it? And basically, they fit into the protect and detect. So the objective here is to detect new pieces of malware that come through from a firewall or end up on a end user's computing device, and to protect those through the different means that they employ to make sure that businesses are protected. So that's a bit of a lead in now, but I am going to hand over to Matt See from WatchGuard, who is going to go into a bit more detail about the process malware takes to attack, some of the vectors, and basically what we can do to help businesses and stop all these issues.
Okay, welcome everyone. As David said, my name's Matthew See. I'm the Manager for Sales Engineering in the APAC region for WatchGuard. And today's going to have a quick look at our firewalls and antivirus enough. A little bit of an agenda here. So we'll look at what we call the cyber kill chain. That'll just give us a bit of a reference point about the sort of things that I'll be discussing. And also we introduce defense in depth. Have a look at evolution of malware, which is a good bit of fun, and also some of the cyber threat and attack vectors that you will be facing, and close up on a bit of security for remote workers, and finally a little bit of overview of the WatchGuard firewall product. So first up, this cyber kill chain is all about how threats get through to your environment. So, reconnaissance is the very first part. They're probing ports on the outside, and that could be someone doing it, or it's more typically a botnet. So just something that's programmed to go out looking for devices on the internet, find out what sort of ports they're running, fingerprint that device, and then see if it can attack that. So then you've got things like delivery of malware into there, and typically they're looking for exploits that they can run to make use of vulnerabilities that are on that endpoint. After which you typically have infection or installation of malware. And finally, command and control is really how malware these days looks back out to the internet for what's called a command and control server. So a command and control server will provide more payload and also instructions on what else to do. Lateral movement is how malware typically moves around your network. And the final objective might be to do things like just deliver malware. It could be to deliver ransomware. It could be to steal information as well. And really, there's no single defense that's going to protect you against a modern day attack. It relies on so many different vectors and so many different, layers in our security to make sure that we are safe. So it's not just the firewall, it's also the endpoint and some of the layers that we have in there. So we'll start having a look at the evolution of malware. Now, this goes way back to 1971, which is a bit hard to believe, but there were computers back then. And for fun, somebody wrote a creeper program, which really did nothing. And then we had a few other bits of fun called Wabbit and things. But the virus was actually termed in 1986. And since then, we've had things like, the first MS-DOS virus was around that time as well. And then the Morris worm, which certainly in my mind is something that sticks in my mind because I used to look after large internet infrastructure back then built on Unix systems, and that's exactly what the Morris worm was targeting. In fact, it was the first worm across the internet. And a worm just simply means it's self-replicating. Now, these days, at that point, everything's still fun, not overly malicious. But, then we're starting to turn up things in viruses, which Melissa virus was the first one that used Outlook and just sent it out via mass email. So that definitely got people's attention. Things like the KVIA virus, that was the first mobile phone virus. So there you go, that's been around for a while. And finally, yes, Mac OS does get viruses. And the first known one for that was 2006. So there you go. And this is around the sort of timeline that a lot of those well-known antivirus companies were established. So they, have a very long history in fighting these sort of things. But back in those days, these viruses were generally not widely dispersed. Things like the very early PC viruses typically relied on being shared by floppy disks and things like that. So the transmission rate was low. It also took a lot of compute resources to build viruses, so the number of viruses generated was quite low as well. But when the internet came along and people started connecting to it, it meant it had automated propagation capabilities, so worms and all those sort of things. So a lot of the antivirus programs of that day were signature-based. A file was fairly static. They'd take a Mac, a signature of that, which is just really, so how big is this file? It's sort of like fingerprinting it. And that was enough to spot a lot of the viruses. But when the bad guys started doing little tricks to hide the viruses, like just padding them in slightly different ways, you needed heuristics to identify those. And it's looking for commonality in those files now. And later on, because of the CPU and memory requirements to keep on scanning everything, the virus vendors turned to real-time scanning so that it would really only scan things when you accessed a binary. So that was enough for that early malware. But then things changed. So this is where it really got interesting. So we're starting to see in 2010 Stuxnet, and that was the first nation-based advanced persistent threat. And that just simply means, APTs are designed to hide. They want to be persistent, so it makes it very hard to get rid of. And they also strike with a level of intent, which we've never seen before. And, with CryptoLocker, it's starting to now become very big news with ransomware. And that was certainly one of the most notable attacks, as was WannaCry. Now, this one's a little bit different because it was a ransom worm. It was self-propagating. And again, it got a lot of attention because of the impacts that it had on the national health network and various other environments. And then we get down to this one here, titanium. Now, this is an incredibly interesting piece of malware. It really upped the ante. So here we're dealing with malware that uses a lot of encryption. It uses fileless malware, which means the fileless means it doesn't appear on the file system of the computer. So therefore, antivirus is not going to be looking for it. It really is memory resident and uses a lot of tricks to hide. Things like acting as device drivers. So device drivers tell your PC how to connect to a printer or how to connect to the network. So they're essential bits of software, legitimate software. So titanium is able to hide behind all of these sort of things. And it used multi-stage infection vectors, and it also used a thing called steganography, which is really interesting because it effectively hid bits of the payload in graphic image files. So if you were looking at your computer system, you'd see a picture file there, you'd look at it, it seems harmless, but there's actual attack data being held and transmitted via that image. And another really interesting thing by this is the group that developed titanium is referred to as Platinum, and they actually operate and focus on the Australia-Pacific region, most likely on behalf of a nation state. So if you work for the Australian government, you may want to be very paranoid about this. This is very high-end stuff. And that simply means that we need to look to next generation malware prevention. And this uses a lot of new techniques that, the old antivirus products are effectively useless, but they do get rid of a lot of the low-hanging fruit, a lot of the background noise. But a traditional antivirus simply needs to up the ante to try and discover and handle this sort of malware. So the first thing was sandboxing, and this is all about locking files into a sandbox, a little piece of your computer which it can't break out of, and we're looking for runtime behavioral analysis of that malware. But to do this, you need a lot of compute resources. And to do it effectively, you really need what's called full system emulation, and that does take a lot of resources. And typically it's done in the cloud. The next step is introducing things like artificial intelligence. So it's not enough now just to fingerprint a file and just rely on that. We need to take tens of thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of data points from files and to run that through different machine learning algorithms. And these ML algorithms have been generated and analyzed through cloud compute resources because of this huge compute resources needed to generate this sort of information. And so there are no signatures with this sort of antivirus detection. It really relies on cloud intelligence and a lot of machine learning. But while sandboxing and machine learning, those two aspects are easy enough to retrofit onto traditional antivirus tools, the next step is endpoint detection and response. And this is really live analysis and monitoring what's happening on the endpoint and correlating that information not only with across the net with other endpoints, but correlating it with information in the cloud. So we're using a lot of live intelligence feeds, and it really is real-time automated response. So this is a huge new area. It's another frontier, I guess, and a lot of this is built on analytic and forensic capabilities. It really requires going quite deep into what's happening. And this is exactly what you need to protect you these days. So some of the vendors involved, LastLine, they really created the whole sandboxing industry, and WatchGuard partners with LastLine. We also partner with Bitdefender and Cylance as well. So these guys are definitely doing the sandboxing, the artificial intelligence. But it's when you get down to the endpoint detection and response, WatchGuard actually have two products in that area. First is threat detection and response, which comes with our firewall product. Another one is an endpoint detection and response capability, which is really purely focused at the endpoint. So you don't need a WatchGuard firewall to use that capability. And as David mentioned, a lot of malware these days is what we call zero-day. And the stats on the slide come from our Secplicity website. It's our threat landscape. And this is taking data, real data that's been seen in the Australian region for the last month. 88% was zero-day malware. So signatures alone would not have spotted this malware. it really relied on things like sandboxing, artificial intelligence, and EDR capabilities to stop it. So let's have a look at a few of the cyber threat and attack vectors. First of all, if someone's going after your network or the computers, the goal is typically to do things like deploy malware, perform credential theft, steal money, or steal data. And here, attackers and malware, they're attacking the operating systems, the protocols that are used on those operating systems. So the protocols are things like how your browser communicates with a web server or how email propagates between different companies. It also wants to attack the client application. So they want to lure you to a website that is malicious, that has been compromised in some way, and trick your browser into downloading that malware for them. Now, if they get in, they will do things like network traversal, and we've even seen malware that uses wireless transmission to move about your network. So that really is an interesting new vector. To protect yourself, you do need firewalls, and these days, firewalls have a lot of individual services on there that run, and it's all designed to try and affect that kill chain at various points of the infection or the command and control. You also need things like patch management for not only your internal computers on your network, but also for the laptops and all the devices around you. They need to be kept up to date so that they don't have vulnerabilities. And you also need things like the Panda AD360 product, which is endpoint protection, in other words, antivirus, but also that endpoint detection and response. To stop the wireless transmission, you do need things like wireless intrusion prevention running on your wireless network. If the attack vector is going after the users, here it's malware, credential theft, or data theft. It's typically using things like email. So you'll get phishing emails. They want you to click on that link, download some malware, or they'll take you off to somewhere that pretends to be Office 365. They want you to log in. They want you to give your username and password. Once they've got that, they can compromise your whole email environment. If it's Office 365, that's extremely dangerous. Not only can they read everything and see everything inside your email, but they can also do things like sending out fake emails, fake invoices, and those sort of things. So that can have a really bad effect on your reputation. Things like web attacks, they're typically, like I said, drawing you off to a malicious website. A watering hole attack is where they target a website that's commonly used in the industry. So there was one against Apple developers where the bad guys compromised a website that Apple developers hung around on to share information. And that whole thing was around getting malware onto their endpoints. Also, things like drive-by downloads. That's how effectively it's attacking your browser and getting your browser to download that malware without you even knowing about it. And they have other techniques like cross-site scripting attacks, which is a little bit technical. I won't go into that, but it's basically a way of tricking a site into utilizing third-party links to download that malware. Even things like just standard file downloads. You know, my kids download gaming mods and all those sort of things, and that's where I normally see malware trying to get into my network. Your phone as well as a target, or even phone communications. So you do need to train users against things like vishing, which is phishing, but simply over voice. So somebody will phone up and pretend to be someone asking for information. The whole goal there is for you to simply hand out information that they should not be privy to. And that's really around social engineering. So some of the controls that you have here are things like the DNS and web filtering on the endpoint. You want to make sure that users don't fall for that malware. They're not going to click on that link in the phishing email. Also network firewalls to look after your corporate network, a lot of the services on there. You want that endpoint protection and also endpoint detection and response to look for the very, very invasive malware. And of course, multi-factor authentication. Now, this one is a really good one in terms of if someone's going after your login via a phishing email, if it takes you off to Office 365 and they capture your credentials, we can protect that through MFA. Simply because when you do try and use those credentials, you need the token, which is typically residing on your mobile phone or maybe a piece of hardware. So you can't steal people's credentials if you don't control that token. The other thing is that social engineering aspect. So in our company, somebody phones up our help desk and says, hey, I need my password reset or I need access to something. They will actually send an alert to my phone to say, I need you to verify your identity. So I have the option there. I can click, yes, it's me. Please continue the phone call, or I can deny it and say, hey, that's not me. I'm not talking to help desk at the moment. Now, I've actually had this where somebody phoned me up one time, and I was in charge of the security for a global organization. And he said he was the group executive of a particular part of the company, and I'd never met the guy before. And I didn't have these sort of tools with me, but I said, well, hang on a tick. You know the security policy. I won't let you in until you verify who you are. And I found out where he was. I found out there's a friend of mine down the corridor from him in the same building. I said, well, go talk to this guy. If he says you are that person, I will let you in. My friend was killing himself laughing because, yes, the guy was the group exec, but I did my job. I was protecting access to our resources. Okay, if the attack vector is going after your data, then here is really credential theft or data breach. So there are things like authentication attacks. It could be a brute force attack. They're simply, you've exposed, say, a remote desktop port on your network so people can connect to their Windows server or PC from home. If they find it open, they'll just start hitting it with username, passwords, trying to guess what's in there. There's another thing called credential stuffing where they've actually found your password that you've used on another site, and they're using variations of that, very targeted, but it's basically still trying to focus in on it's a limited set of a brute force attack. Then, if they do get in there after that data theft, the exfiltration of data, and this could also be a malicious insider, which is a big problem. I've had a few phone calls about those sort of attacks recently. There's also ransomware attacks where they actually steal the data first, then give you ransomware, and then say, look, if you don't pay the ransom, we will release your data on the internet. Finally, there's a loss of your device. It could be a laptop or a phone. People leave them on trains, on planes, in airports, anywhere. It is an issue, even if somebody breaks into your house and steals your laptop. The corporate data you have on there might be very sensitive. So again, some of the controls around here, multi-factor authentication, we can use that to even lock down the login to your laptop, protect all the authentication into Office 365 and cloud resources, authentication to VPNs and those sort of things. Also, obviously, firewalls. We want to have all those application proxies on there to identify and track the connections, run things like data loss prevention algorithms, looking for that information flowing through. Finally, there's also things like the endpoint control, but there's also one called data control. Now, this is really interesting because it came through GDPR in Europe. It effectively fingerprints all the data everywhere on your network, including on mobile devices, and it tracks who has that data and who's accessing the data and what they're doing with it. And this is a really, really good way to keep visibility of what's happening in your environment. Also, full disk encryption to protect those devices if they're lost or stolen. The bad guys can't get access to anything unless they can decrypt what's on there. And finally, dark web scanning. So this is a way that we can detect if your credentials have actually been identified on the dark web as part of a data breach. And obviously you can scan those once off, or you can actually sign up and have that continual scanning for your credentials. So let's have a look at how we put this into practice. With security, before COVID-19, typically we worked in an office environment. And that meant that everything in there was well defined, it was controlled, all the assets were managed. You had hopefully a secure wireless network, you had a firewall at the perimeter, and everything's being patched and it's all backed up. Now that's great, but and some of the controls you can have on there are things like the antivirus and the patch management and the data control. But with COVID-19, oops, I forgot multi-factor authentication. I need to look at my slides. MFA can protect access through the firewall, protect the logins to the laptop, the servers, and PCs on your network. But during COVID-19, we've all been told to work from home. And this means now we're accessing the corporate environment over the internet. So we need to start using things to protect that connection. One might be a VPN, in which case you should be using a full tunnel VPN. The next thing, you want to extend the multi-factor authentication onto that VPN and also into things like Office 365. So nobody can log into those environments unless they have the token. Another thing you can do on the endpoint is implement DNS and web filtering to protect against those phishing attacks. And also you've got all the AV, the patch management, disk encryption, and data control for that environment as well. Now, a quick run through on the WatchGuard Firebox. So yes, just letting you know what we sell. We sell firewalls from the little ones right up to the big firewalls. We have virtual firewalls for virtualization environments. And we also have firewalls for the cloud environments like Amazon and Azure. Very easy to deploy and to manage, really designed for small to medium enterprise, which is effectively what WatchGuard looks after. We really don't bother chasing the enterprise. Our focus is really on the small to medium, anywhere from 5 up to 7,500 users. On the firewalls, we typically run the total security suite, and there's a lot of stuff on there, but it really goes back to that defense in depth and making sure that we cover that cyber kill chain at multiple different layers. I will just highlight a couple of layers on there. The Access Portal and Intelligent AV, those particular services are only available on the current generation firewalls that we sell, on the rack mount series, as well as on the T40 and the T80. If you've got anything else like a smaller device, T15, T20 or T35, it won't run on those platforms. Now, it looks like that firewall's got a lot to do, but the main point here is the fact that the efficacy and the performance is there. The efficacy is really just showing that, hey, look, in the NSS Labs security report, these guys actually test the solutions. They make sure that they actually do what they say they can do. And WatchGuard for 3 years in a row have been one of the recommended solutions. We were blocking 100% of the evasions and techniques that they use to try and get malware or sort of attacks through our environment. And basically, we were able to stop all of those. In terms of the cost effectiveness, it really comes down to the fact that WatchGuard includes pretty much everything in there. So our position on this graph would actually be better if they included the analysis around all the logging and reporting solutions and the management solutions we actually include with our product. A lot of the other guys make you pay for that. The other chart that's on there, the Marcom report, just simply shows the performance of the firewall when analyzing HTTPS traffic. David actually did mention the fact that the bulk of malware these days comes down via encrypted HTTPS tunnels. And I think it was around 67%. And here it's quoting that NSS Labs believe 75% of web traffic will be encrypted by 2019. I think that particular stat has already been broken. But basically, the performance of our firewall is there. We're very well known for being able to perform at very high levels with everything switched on and to be able to decrypt and analyze HTTPS traffic. Now, don't worry about the slide. It's a little bit detailed, but it's just a little bit to clarify what threat detection and response does. In this case, it's a service that you get with our firewall. It takes information from all the layers of the firewall, feeds that into our cloud, threat-seeking cloud environment. It analyzes all that information. It's also taking in threat intelligence feeds, and it's also getting telemetry data from what's happening on your laptop. So it's looking at all the processes, looking at the file system, looking at the registry, looking at API calls on that laptop, and also the network activity. So if somebody is targeting you with malware, either through a USB key or a phishing email or something like that, basically we're correlating all that information with intelligence that we have up in the cloud, and it really is about that next generation style of antivirus where it's not relying on anything like signatures anymore. Some of the components on there are things like a host ransomware prevention module, which is all about containing CryptoLocker and those sort of things. If you do get a host infected on your network, we do host containment, which means that the infection is not going to spread across your network. And as soon as we've cleaned it up, it's basically released back onto the network live. And it also includes sandboxing as well. Another thing I'll quickly highlight on there is visibility. So it's useless to have a firewall that's doing a lot of things if you really can't understand what it's doing. With WatchGuard products, we have a lot of visibility tools, not only inbuilt into the product, but also available if you want to run it on your network, you can do so, or you can actually access that via the cloud, which is optional. You don't have to do that. But basically, it just means that you've got all that information in a way that you can actually make sense of it. The section in the middle here with the colors, the colored blocks, that actually shows you who is chewing up your network at any given time. So the biggest block is the person who's doing the most traffic. You can actually click through and filter on them and find out what applications they're running, what websites they're going to, and what are the things that they might be doing that you need to look at. So it's all about usability, and by using the cloud environment, it's also about scalability as well. So it really makes the access to this data fast, very visible, and very usable.
Thanks, Matt. That was incredibly informative, as they always are with you. I certainly think there's some great technology coming through, which is why we partner with WatchGuard and why we've found their products to be the best in the market, and certainly from a value perspective, very well performing compared to others out there. I'm going to hand it back to everyone else and see if there's any questions from any of our attendees. I did like you talking about the Wi-Fi. I think that's certainly an underrepresented area there, Matt. I think that there's a lot of firms out there who have Wi-Fi and are using, consumer level access points with very little protections. And I think that's an area that really needs to be increased. I think most businesses just aren't really, focused on that as a vector for attacks, and I think it's becoming more prevalent, certainly from drive-by Wi-Fi attacks and things like that.